Hello, I'm Sarah and I'm here to talk to you about the impact of co-production and being involved. To start off, I'll talk a little bit about me and then I'll get into co-production, what it means to me and some of the projects that I've worked on. On the left there, we've got a photo of me at a co-production conference talking about working with autistic children and young people who also have a learning disability and supporting them to make decisions about their own health. To talk about the things that I've done so far, I've worked with autistic children and young people mainly within charities and in research, using my own experiences of being autistic and dyspraxic. I've taken part in research through co-production and involvement that's been on the side of things where I've been the person supporting the involvement of others and also been the involved person myself. And I'm currently doing a PhD based at King's College London looking at inclusive involvement for disabled people. So that's supporting disabled people to be involved in projects in ways that are inclusive and accessible for them. It might be useful to kind of explain what I mean by co-production using some of the definitions that everyone uses and how that kind of works in practice for me. So typically co-production is described as working together or doing projects with people rather than to, about or for them. So that with is really important because it's that sense of partnership working and doing things in a way where they're led by everyone involved. So the ideas are all generated by everyone and everything is worked on together. There's less of a hierarchy and more of a kind of egalitarian way of working. That means that work is done for equal benefit, and that work is kind of done in partnership. No one is meant to be doing things kind of alone or in isolation. So in practice, I've done this on large-scale projects which have had a lot of funding and have taken a lot of planning, and also some ideas that have been thought up through conversations. So these were kind of smaller projects that were basically conversations that happened in a PhD office over a lunch break, and then they blossomed into ideas of their own. So taking that big scale project idea, for me, this all started with a grant application and some researchers wanted people to get involved. So I put my hand up and started getting into the conversations. For all of us, it was important that the ideas were generated together and each person was given equal bearing. And ideas were brought to the table not to critique them, but to kind of provide illumination from different directions. And this was a funding application that brought together people to talk about a topic that may have kind of led things slightly further away from the original funding calls into anticipation, just because together we realised that we really wanted to kind of shape it in a way that best fit the community's needs. And the most important thing was getting people in before too many decisions were made, because if that hadn't have happened, then I think they would have fit the funding call more directly, but wouldn't have had a project that really fit the needs of the community. All of the people involved, so there's 5 of us on the panel that are co-producing this project, that are autistic anyway. We all have felt valued and we continue to feel valued in this project. And importantly, these things take a lot more time than you think. We spent a long time building relationships while we were building the grant application and waiting to kind of hear if we'd been funded, and started this way back in 2017, and we're still currently at the kind of recruitment stages of the research. So it's a lot longer than I thought I would have been involved, but that just speaks to how well these relationships have been formed and kind of how well the project has been running. So this project ended up being the Strata Trial, which is a clinical trial into how useful sertraline is in treating anxiety in autistic adults. This was a topic that was really important to all of the autistic people involved, because we've all experienced anxiety, we've all experienced treatments that don't work for our anxiety, and we feel the brunt of the kind of evidence base not being specific enough to us. So we know that sertraline works well for most populations, and we know that CBT works well for most populations, but no one's really been asking how well it works for autistic people who are often ostracized from clinical settings because we are autistic and we're meant to believe that autistic anxiety is inevitable. So we really honed this into something that we wanted answered. Co-production and involvement are normally really well used in clinical trials through the term and kind of umbrella of patient and public involvement, but were actually quite novel as part of this funding application. It was the first time the principal investigator had tried to do it, and we were the only application to bring in involvement in our application. All other applications for this funding were done just by researchers, so we really stood out. It also required a strong commitment from all involved and provided learning opportunities for those who are new to this way of working. So we brought along with us all of the people who are quite used to traditional control trials and kind of taught them about working with patients and the public in creating how the research kind of works. We turned the initial idea into something we really wanted answered in research. So the researchers had looked at the key priority areas for autistic people in research and saw that anxiety treatments was one, and so they started to build an idea, and then they just let us run away with the application and then provided their kind of guidance on what a randomized controlled trial looks like. So it was a real kind of way of partnership working, because we brought our autistic experience, but they also brought their research and medical experience, and it was that kind of cementing that you need both sides of this to get it right that I really enjoyed. So as I said, we co-designed the grant application completely. We fundamentally changed the research design to be something that would be acceptable to autistic people. We co-designed the research materials so they would be kind of accessible to autistic people. And we built the recruitment strategy together because we know where to find autistic people, which sounds a bit creepy, but it makes sense when you're thinking about participant recruitment and kind of making sure that every part of that strategy and how people enroll in the study wasn't something that was intimidating. It was something that people felt they could do. And we also co-designed the ethics application, and one of the autistic members of the involvement group went to the ethics board and presented that to the ethics board, and kind of really changed how the ethics board thought about doing research and involvement in a way that involves those with conditions, to kind of talk about why decisions have been made and why they're supporting ethical research. We learned so much doing this. I think for us, power was something we brought up early, and it's something that I think needs to be addressed in any project, particularly as we shifted in power dynamics between the funder at the beginning, then the university, and then kind of who has the most power in the kind of running of the project and how you continue to involve people. Paying people fairly and quickly is something that really encourages participation and involvement, and universities don't make this easy. Over the 5 years that I've been involved in this project, the involvement payment process has actually changed dramatically because it was so difficult and it did take so much time. And also, relationships take a long time to build. We had existing relationships as the autistic people involved because we've interacted with each other either online or in real life, I guess you could call it, before. But we've also built relationships with the researchers, with the research staff, and kind of everyone who's been involved in this project. And that's really kind of helped with that kind of power and it feeling like something we're doing together rather than something we do intermittently together. Everyone has to be committed to this way of working. It really helped that the principal investigator was committed and continues to be committed, and that filters down into everyone that is hired and everyone that interacts with this project. Large grant funding, to put it really bluntly, does make it a lot easier to do this, just because there is the money to facilitate involvement and people are fairly compensated for what they're offering. Progress can be slow. I'm sure anyone working in medical research can understand that. but you can plan for that progress to be slow. So we knew that participant recruitment would start to happen in this quarter of 2022, and so that gave us time to kind of know when decisions needed to be made. And also, working in this way made sense for the autistic people involved and the researchers involved because we had that shared commitment. It made sense that we would design things that felt quite invasive, like chemical anxiety treatments, to be kind of like done in a way that's most palatable to autistic people. And we've actually had a lot better outcomes and so much positive feedback than if we'd been excluded from that research design process. So every autistic person that's been recruited into the study has said how much they value the research materials, and they can see our kind of hands in each piece of what's been done. So if you think about those small scale projects, I think they always tend to start with a conversation, and so having those existing relationships is really kind of key to facilitating that space for talking and having someone you can just have a chat with and think, is this a project that's worth pursuing? Am I completely off base here, or am I doing okay? Unfortunately, that does mean that funding can be harder to come by because it's that kind of chicken egg situation of you've technically got a project before you've got funding, or do you secure funding and not know where the project's going to head because you're working on it together? Because often funding applications want you to have that fully fleshed out project, but that doesn't allow for the kind of flexibility that working with people needs, because you don't know how long things are going to take when you're kind of making those decisions together and taking that time to get things right. It doesn't make the work any less impactful. One of the projects that I've worked on has been the first paper to describe autistic people's anxiety in a way that actually is described from the perspective of autistic adults, which feels like it shouldn't be revolutionary. Why don't we know what sensory experiences of autistic people are like? Why has no one asked before? And ideas can feel like a conversation, and it's a bit easier to kind of shape and explain what you're talking about when it is a conversation, rather than some of that back and throw over emails where you're kind of trying to really pin down what you're trying to talk about. And it was a really kind of grassroots way of working. So I was working with a researcher who was interested in sensory experiences of autistic people, and it was that idea that kind of snowballed from, I can't find a reference that comes from autistic perspectives about sensory experiences, to, should we do some research about what autistic people's sensory experiences are and actually ask them, rather than think we know what we're talking about. And they can grow into much bigger projects. So this piece of work, although it finished and was its own kind of discrete project, has now supported that researcher to think about wider ways of thinking about sensory experiences of autistic people, and a whole kind of postdoc past their PhD. They can feel like there's more control because there are less people, but you also feel like you've got more responsibility to get things right. So from this project, we learned that paying people can be really hard. We had really limited funds because we didn't have a specific budget. We were kind of siphoning off the budget of other projects as much as we could. Getting university support can be incredibly difficult, to say the least, just because it's not going through the traditional processes that universities expect. The project took way longer than we expected because it was that kind of passion project that all of us had on the side. We didn't have that kind of dedicated model of a research assistant or associate working on it. It was what we were doing in our kind of free time almost. The team wasn't large, and it didn't have to be. That made it easier for decision making, and also the fact that we didn't necessarily have a budget and we weren't drawing on too many people's resources. It was really quick to make decisions, but implementing those decisions was a lot slower because the capacity of the team was a lot less. And the power differentials were really starkly felt at points, just because it was people who have lived experience, so autistic people, kind of interacting with researchers, and some of those things like having the data first is something that researchers tend to have because that's the way that ethics want things to happen. And so it's almost like we can't necessarily break down all of these power barriers, power imbalances, I guess you could call them, because of how research is meant to work. So we kind of had to manage those things and figure out the easiest ways to do things like transport data. Our outputs were difficult to create just because we were doing this alongside so many other things, and a lot of us had to carve out time for those things like writing papers or writing blogs or kind of conference posters. And it was really novel because we, I guess, reinforced what I've heard when talking to other autistic people, but what other people just hadn't realised about our sensory experiences. So we took those anecdotes and we turned them into research, and it was a priority that kind of was felt amongst the community. And we were kind of being prospective about things rather than retrospective. So we came up with these ideas and tried to answer some of the questions that we felt might come up. That's probably been a bit too much of a whistle-stop tour. If you've got any further questions, you can email me at my KCL email address, sarah.o'brien@kcl.ac.uk. If you want to follow along for some random ramblings about research, writing a book, or just what it's like being an autistic person, you can follow me on Twitter at sarahmarieob. My website is sarahmobrien.com, and if you want to find out about the Strata project, they're strata.blogs.bristol.ac.uk. That's got some co-produced work on there and some updates from the project team. And if you want to hear more about the sensory research, the psychological podcast interviewed Karen, who was the PhD student I bumped into that lunchtime, and she speaks on it on season 3, episode 1. It offers a kind of great look into the paper we co-wrote together. Probably not the difficulty of getting that paper accepted and published, but really talks through why we did what we did and how it ended up working. Thanks for listening along to my little rambles. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and the discussions that come out of today.